Hey out there, people. So today I'm going to be responding to some comments that people have left in the comments section of my most viewed video, Top 10 Worst and Best Night Gallery Episodes. That video is my most successful as of today. I really have no idea why. It's just taken off, I guess because there aren't enough Night Gallery Top 10 lists. Is this camera a little off-center there? Anyway, I have some comments here, and I think they're really interesting because obviously if you make a top 5 worst list, some people are going to disagree with you and be like, actually, that episode's one of my favorites. What I find interesting is that so many people have jumped to the defense of The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. I've heard some other terrible takes in the comment section of my Night Gallery video. There's like 171 comments as of me recording this. And I posted it like 2 years ago, all the way back in 2020, I think. Like, for instance, someone said that I shouldn't have said that in The Ring with the Red Velvet Ropes there's objectification of women, even though it's literally a story about some lady being like a prize for these boxers that like gets inherited. Whichever boxer wins, they like inherit her as their wife. If that's not objectifying women, I don't know what you think is objectifying women. I think that's a pretty solid example of like objectification of women, just treating them like property to be inherited and bought and sold and shit. You know, that's kind of a dehumanizing. Call me crazy, call me woke or whatever, but... But anyway, one of the most controversial ones that I said was The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. And I have no idea why this is. I think it's just because The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is shown on TV all the fucking time. Like, you turn to any broadcast Night Gallery across America, any rerun segment, and Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes will always be on there, guaranteed. I have no idea why this is. I have no idea why it's overplayed to hell. There's so many better episodes. For whatever reason, Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes has a lot of fans. And just to prove that I do go into the comment section, I do listen to you, I do care what you have to say, I'm going to respond to some of them here. I've already responded to some of them in comment form, but I thought it'd be more efficient to respond to a few in video form. First comment. You got the premise about the boy who could predict earthquakes wrong. He could only predict things he knew about. He has no way of causing it or any of the others to happen. Saw this in the 1970s. Don't read in things that are obviously not occurring. I think the issue with this comment is that reading in things is a vital facet of media analysis. Now, if we take The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes as a story, thematically it's about exploitation by the media, exploitation of people with talent by the media. That's what The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is fundamentally about. Now, whether you like the episode or you don't like the episode, that is what the episode is going for. It's about a TV executive who happens upon this little boy with like psychic powers, and they make a show out of it. And this is a well-documented phenomenon that media is exploitative. Like, you know, the 1970s and 80s and 90s were the age of new wave philosophy, and you had figures like Uri Geller coming on TV and saying, look, I can bend spoons with my mind, and people took this at face value. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is kind of the flip side of that. It's about exploitation of a figure, not exploitation by a figure, but that's what it's about. As to whether psychic phenomena exists or not, that's an underexplored field of neurology. And do I think most people have telepathic powers? No, probably not. But do I think ESP could potentially be a thing that doesn't have enough study done on it? Sure, it's an interesting concept. My issue with The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is that at the end, there's a supernova. The sun goes supernova. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not the boy predicted it or whether he caused it. The fact of the matter is the sun goes supernova, and that is not possible under any circumstances. It's terrible science fiction. My problem with the sun going supernova at the end of the episode is that there's no foreshadowing saying that that's going to happen. There's no reason for it to happen. It just does. It feels like a plot contrivance. And given that the episode explicitly states that the kid can only predict things that he's read about or seen on TV or knows something about, that he can only predict things he knows about, I am going to draw the conclusion that the end of the story where the sun goes supernova is a direct result of him learning about supernovas in an astronomy textbook, because the sun cannot go supernova within the parameters of accepted science. That's not something that can happen. The sun simply does not have enough mass to go supernova. And you can say, oh, it's a horror episode, it doesn't need to confine itself to scientifically accepted facts, but it's not like a ghost. It's the sun. It's a real thing in real outer space. So I expect the episode to kind of give a shit about like that, you know, like the sun just doesn't have enough mass to go supernova. And furthermore, if I'm going to assume that the writers have at least a little bit of talent, which I think they do, Night Gallery had some of the best science fiction and horror writers of its time, I'm going to assume that the sun going supernova is a direct result of the exploitation of the psychic kid by the media, which is the central theme of the episode. And that if they hadn't given him this huge platform and hadn't exploited his psychic abilities, then the sun wouldn't go supernova. Because otherwise, if the sun was just going to go supernova no matter what, then the entire episode and everything that happens in it is inconsequential, and we have no reason to follow this kid around prior to the sun going supernova, because the sun will just go supernova no matter what happens, whether this kid is exploited or not, so it doesn't even matter. And at the end of the day, I think Night Gallery, say what you will about it, it can be cheesy at points, but I always think it tries to send at least some kind of a message. I think the message of The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is just poorly communicated, because the consequence of the kid being exploited by the media, of his psychic powers being used for monetary gain, the consequence of the sun going supernova is poorly thought out. But I do think it's trying to send that message, that if the kid wasn't exploited, if his psychic powers weren't overused and stressed, then the sun wouldn't have gone supernova. Because otherwise what we have a story about is a story that at first appears to be about some kid with psychic powers, but then just turns into a doomsday scenario. And I think that's much too random. Now, the episode is confusing in that regard, and it's easy for someone to get confused. I'm confused by it quite a bit, in case you couldn't tell. It would be kind of like in A Fear of Spiders, if the guy is scared of spiders the whole episode, and then out of nowhere, like a random big cockroach comes out. There's nothing to foreshadow that, and there's nothing to imply that, and we don't know if he's scared of cockroaches, so it's irrelevant to the story thus far. The payoff only works, the finale only works because it's a big spider. If it was a big worm or something, it would make no sense. It would be inconsistent and poorly written. And I think The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is an example of a really poorly written episode that sets out to make a kind of statement about media exploitation, which is an important message and can be done very well. It's been handled very well in other things. But I don't think The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes succeeds in that department. And you can say all you want, oh, he only predicts the sun going supernova. But at the end of the day, if he's only predicting that the sun is going supernova and the sun is going to go supernova no matter what, then all we're watching is a story with zero stakes where no matter what the characters do, they just blow up at the end. And I've pointed this out before, but that's a really boring type of story that I don't think Night Gallery was going for. I think the implication is that because the kid knows about supernovas, the sun goes supernova. That's a pretty obvious conclusion to draw. It's in the subtext of the episode. I'm not sure why so many people can't really grasp that. I think maybe it's that a lot of these people are boomers and maybe they're just bad at grasping subtext, but I'm pretty sure that's well written into the script. Another comment says, I disagree with so much of what you have to say about Night Gallery that I quit listening. Night Gallery was broadcast on television before you were born. You don't understand the audience that watched the episodes. I don't think you should be negatively criticizing any work of film art. You should stop talking after saying you liked an episode or did not like an episode. When you make a film work as good as what you think is the worst of Night Gallery episodes, then you will have room to criticize. When the resources that were available for making the Night Gallery are considered, there are no bad episodes. Can't wait to see your production. I feel a little bad about my tone, but you have insulted something I watched when it aired. Now this is a really interesting take that I haven't seen anywhere else. I've never heard that because of the year you were born or when you watched a show, you're not able to talk about that show or discuss it in any capacity. And I'm not sure what the resources that were available means. I mean, it was a well-funded show. It was on NBC. It's not like it was this like indie thing, this like indie project. It's a very big budget, well-funded, well-known show that had a pretty decent budget behind it. It's not like they were like scrapyard filmmakers. I've made films, I'd say, that are as good as the worst of Night Gallery. Heck yeah. I'd say my movie, The Orwellians, is as good or better than something like The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. I think The Orwellians has better writing, for sure. But that's entirely besides the point. Night Gallery was one of the first shows I ever watched. It might have been the first TV show I ever watched, like multiple episodes of. And in that regard, it had a tremendous impact on my views of speculative fiction, of the power of horror and science fiction. And just because I don't like a couple episodes does not at all mean I'm shitting on the show. Every TV show has some bad episodes. Like, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, I think, is one of the most well-written shows ever made. It's easily, I think, an argument can be made that it's the best Star Trek show. Yet there are some terrible episodes. That's inevitable when you have over 100 episodes. The episode where they force the lesbian relationship with Dax, I think, is a crap episode. But that's just kind of inevitable when you have a shit ton of episodes. Like, they're not all going to be winners. If you have to make a new episode every week, they're not all going to be good. But I absolutely don't think you can't talk about a show that you didn't watch when it first aired. I think reruns are great for understanding the past. And I think furthermore that I've put in a lot of effort to engage with the best of horror and science fiction so I can make the best of horror and science fiction. That's why I don't consume shit like Rick and Morty. I mean, I know that's what my generation is supposed to enjoy, but I tell Rick and Morty to fuck it and suck it. And I say Justin Roiland is ass. He's an ass writer. And Rod Serling and Richard Matheson, those guys, they're so fucking cool. They're like my fucking idols. So the fact that I respect Night Gallery as a show is seemingly ignored by this comment, who just thinks that everyone can just watch the shows that are airing when they're alive, and they can't watch anything from before they're born, which I think is just a terrible take. I like watching movies and shows and shit from before I was born, because I think, in general, most movies and shows from before I was born are better than what's coming out nowadays, and I think you can learn more about film from, like, Indiana Jones than you can from Indiana Jones 5 and The Dial of Destiny. Call me crazy, but I just think, like, more people of my generation, of my age, should be watching shit like Night Gallery and shit like Twilight Zone, because they're good shows. They're timeless. They really don't age. Another comment says, I think in The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, the boy doesn't cause the supernova to happen. He just now knows about what a supernova is and sees that one is about to happen. If this show is more about the supernatural, why does it have to conform to scientific thinking? That's an interesting point. Generally, horror doesn't need to conform to scientific thinking. But if it has scientific elements, if it's sci-fi / horror, I'd expect for it to at least have a little bit of intelligence regarding, like, basic shit about astronomy. Like, you can have a race of vampire aliens who are like vampires, but they're aliens. You know, that's plausible. I can buy that. That on the planet Blorpo, there's a race of aliens who have to drink blood to survive. In fact, that's the plot of the Vampirella comic, and they do it pretty well, except the planet isn't named Lorpo. On the other hand, if you have a sci-fi story or a horror story where the sun just spontaneously combusts, I'm going to be a little more skeptical of that, and I think, like I said earlier, it's used as a plot contrivance, just a consequence to the kid's psychic powers, and I think that's a bad way to write an episode. I think, like, it should have been like at the end, I'm going to posit a better episode here. At the end, the kid, he like dies or something. He predicts his own death, you know, and then the mother's like, "Why did you do this, you bastards? Why did you take advantage of my son's gift?" You know, he like predicts that he's going to die. That'd be an effective episode that would get across its point much better than just having the sun blow up at the end when there's no indication earlier in the episode that that's going to happen. It's like a deus ex machina, but like the opposite of that. It's bad writing. The comment continues, Island of Lost Souls is a great film. Yet another bizarre example of people defending something that I had no idea anyone wanted to defend. If you actually have read the Island of Dr. Moreau novel, which I have by H.G. Wells, you realize that Island of the Lost Souls is like a shit adaptation of Island of Dr. Moreau, and they just add in this hot, sexy Panther woman character for no reason. She's not in the book. It's just to sell tickets, and they just put like all these characters in there who were not in the book. And I think the Val Kilmer, Marlon Brando adaptation of Island of Dr. Moreau is actually much fucking better than Island of Lost Souls. Underrated classic. Everyone should watch the Island of Dr. Moreau with Marlon Brando. It's a great fucking movie, and much better adaptation of Island of Lost Souls. The next comment reads, "You're completely misunderstanding how the boy who predicted earthquakes' powers worked. He didn't cause any of those things to happen, but in order to be able to predict them, he had to be aware of them. If he didn't know that a girl was missing, he wouldn't have been able to predict her rescue. It is perhaps a bit coincidental that he just happened to read about supernovas just before it was to happen, but I can let it pass. I'm glad you like spiders, though." Spider emoji. That's not a coincidence. When you're writing a TV show or a movie, nothing is a coincidence because it's not a spontaneous real-world scenario. It is a constructed, fictive scenario. So if they bother to mention that the boy who predicted earthquakes read about supernovas right before a supernova happens, then I'm going to assume that that's somehow relevant to the story, otherwise they wouldn't write that in there. And if they do write in needlessly confusing information which has no actual bearing on the story, then what that is bad writing. It's really as simple as that. Just the fact that I can misunderstand how the boy who predicted earthquakes' powers works, just that I can misunderstand it, speaks to how needlessly confusing and convoluted this episode is and how poorly it's written. Take, for example, The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, which is an absolute all-time best of Night Gallery. I think it was on my top 5 best list. There were some on my top 5 best and worst list that I might have changed my opinion on in the past 2 years. But Girl with the Hungry Eyes is a great episode because it's also making a societal statement, a statement about a current issue in society and contemporary American life through the use of a paranormal occurrence. It's a really well-written episode about the over-sexualization of models in advertising. And it could even be used today with the conversation that everyone is having about unachievable body standards and the like. I think The Girl with the Hungry Eyes is a great episode as far as that goes. It's like very on point. And not once during the entire episode am I confused about how Joanna Pettit's powers work. It's like, you know where she gets her powers from, you know what she does to these guys, you know the guys are attracted to her, you know what's going on, you know who she is, you know what she's made of, you know exactly like what her whole deal is. By the end of the episode, you have a really good understanding of The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, by the end of Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, I still don't know jack shit about this kid or why I should care or why the earth is blowing up, right? It's a poorly written episode, it's needlessly confusing, and it doesn't fully explain the powers or traits of its main character, which should be a pretty simple thing to do, and is done really well in Girl with Hungry Eyes, but I don't think it's done well at all in Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. Another comment here. Okay, the kid explains at the start that he can only predict things he has knowledge of, like he predicted the little girl who was lost was going to found. He says if he hadn't known the girl was lost, he would not have been able to predict that, just like he doesn't know anything about novas or supernovas. Those are the same thing, just thought I'd point that out, until he reads a book on them. That's when he makes up this lie about the world being a better place in a new day, because he wants people to think things are going to be like paradise. He doesn't want them to know the sun is going to explode. I think Clint Howard did an amazing job in that role. It's one of my favorites because of his performance. Anyway, I enjoyed your review. See, when the Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes tells everyone that it's going to be paradise tomorrow, it's going to be a new day, that's not even an effective lie, because everyone just wakes up the next morning and they realize, oh shit, the earth is going to end, and that lying little shit on TV told us that it was going to be all great, but it's actually not going to be all great. Like, I really don't care that Clint Howard's character is a lying bastard to the entire population of Earth. Also, it doesn't even matter if he says that it's going to be paradise or if he says that the world's going to end, because no matter what, the world is going to end. It's not like, humanity can just escape the world in like escape pods. It's like everyone is going to die, so it doesn't matter what he says. And I get that maybe back in the 70s it was creepy to have this little kid be like, ooh, it's going to be a new day, it's going to be paradise, it's going to be perfect, ooh. That's kind of creepy, but in terms of just adequate storytelling, in terms of like actually making a story that makes sense, it just makes Clint Howard come off like really entitled and like he thinks he knows what's best for humanity and he's not interested in like telling the truth, which is not a good look on his part. Personally, I do think Clint Howard definitely get the short end of the stick usually in comparison to Ron Howard. But if I had a role like this, I mean, I'd be embarrassed. This is a really poorly defined role. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes has like zero character. He's just kind of used as a plot device. It's not like you give a shit about him or his parents or anyone, because, they're all going to die. Like I mentioned earlier, this story would make much more sense if it followed someone who is actually, like, invested in the world ending, like an astronomer at an observatory or something who notices that the world's going down. The problem mainly with The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is that the first half of the episode is extremely realistic and takes place in a very realistic universe. All these close-up shots in the TV studio, and the girl is like in the earthquake, or the girl's lost, and that's all very realistic. So then when you have the sun exploding at the end, it's like, what the fuck? How this episode just zoomed from 0 to 10? I can suspend my disbelief in sci-fi and horror. In fact, I hate science fiction that adheres 100% to real science. I think that's like some nerd shit. I think good science fiction needs to stretch the truth a little to be fun. But on the other hand, I think if you set your story in a really realistic setting, you need to keep in mind that you can't just go batshit off the rails and, have everything happen at once. Like, for instance, if in Taxi Driver, a really grounded drama where we assume that nothing can happen in there that wouldn't happen in real life, if Travis Bickle at the end of that, because he hates New York and the scum and villainy on the streets, if he, buys a bunch of nukes from a Soviet arms dealer and blows the whole ass city off the map, that would kind of ruin the movie and make it impossible for the audience to suspend their disbelief and kind of make it goofy at the end, and Taxi Driver would not be the well-revered classic we all know it as. On the other hand, a movie like Rocky IV, which is set in like an exaggerated cartoon universe, can get away with that because by its nature, it's goofy and not really meant to be taken seriously. And then somewhere between Taxi Driver and Rocky IV, you have something like The King of Comedy, where not everything that happens in that movie works out exactly the way it would in real life, but it's not exactly a cartoon. It's set in kind of this weird in-between spot. So there's like a spectrum as to how realistic you can make your story. But you can't have a realistic story that suddenly just gets batshit crazy out of nowhere. That's called jumping the shark. And it's a really well-known, thing among screenwriters, and that's exactly what The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes does. It's kind of impressive that it does it in just 30 minutes, that it goes from being this really grounded, serious drama about this kid with psychic powers to being this post-apocalyptic supernova scenario that just comes out of nowhere. That's a serious escalation of events there, and it causes me not to take the episode seriously because that's just way too fucking ridiculous. It'd make much more sense if an asteroid actually hit the Earth. That's actually possible. Unlike the sun going supernova, it can't do that. It doesn't have enough mass, and they knew this back in the 70s, and they could have just asked NASA, hey, can the sun go supernova? And NASA would have been like, fuck no. And they would have been like, okay, instead of having the sun go supernova, we'll have it so that an asteroid strikes the Earth. Because that's actually scientifically possible. It would carry just as much weight. It would still be really goofy, and I don't think it would fit within the context of the episode up until that point, but it would at least make sense. So I'd at least have some respect for this episode. Another comment. Dude was totally off on what The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes was about and how his psychic powers worked. It made me question if he actually watched the episode. Now, if Nicholas thinks it's a terrible episode, just for future reference, my name does not have an H in it. If Nicholas thinks it's a terrible episode, that's definitely his privilege and prerogative, and I respect that. I don't think it's a great episode either, but it's hardly the worst. That would be the different ones. Blech. Everyone's tastes are different. However, while I was ready to bail, as well over Nicholas's missing of well-explained plot points, nothing in The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is well-explained or even remotely coherent, that's why it's one of the worst episodes, I did manage to watch all the way through. The Different Ones is actually a great fucking episode, Night Gallery. If I recall, I didn't put it on the top 5 best list, but it is really great. It's like if Eye of the Beholder from Twilight Zone was actually good and competent and effective in proving that beauty is only in the eye of the beholder. I've been on record before stating that Eye of the Beholder doesn't work from a narrative perspective. I've made a whole video about that. Maybe I'll talk about it again sometime. But it's a great lesson in how not to make a speculative fiction story with a twist ending. The Different Ones, on the other hand, I think is a really great episode about societal expectations and kind of fitting in. It's about conformity. I think Night Gallery is great in that, in the There Aren't Any More McBains episode, the guy basically looks like a modern-day hipster. And in The Different Ones, the kid basically looks like an emo. Night Gallery kind of predicted a lot of future fashions. I think that's really cool and awesome. And I think The Different Ones absolutely kicks Eye of the Beholder's ass, but it's never on TV that much. Whenever there's Night Gallery reruns on, the Different Ones is barely on, which is weird because it's a great episode, as opposed to The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, which is just really poorly written. There isn't a single thing about The Different Ones that makes me go, yeah, the script writers on this one had no idea. No, that's a really well-written episode, actually. The Different Ones gets a lot of shit, but it's actually a vast improvement over Eye of the Beholder. As I mentioned in my original Night Gallery video, Night Gallery does recycle storylines from Twilight Zone quite a bit, but I think The Different Ones is a case of Night Gallery actually improving on a Twilight Zone episode, because Eye of the Beholder is crap. Anyway, final comment here. When you put The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes as one of the 5 worst, I knew it was over. I predict your review stinks to high hell. Take your review, burn it, and bury it in a haunted grave next to the sounding sea, where a raven caws eternally. Nevermore, nevermore. Well, that's quite the vitriolic comment for an episode that, all things considered, is a massive pile of shit and a real embarrassment to Night Gallery's legacy. I don't know, as I said, why so many people defend The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. It really is a great example of how to make a horror story that nobody can possibly take seriously, because it's just so goddamn goofy to have a story where the sun explodes at the end. That's like a royal meme right there. It really is just like an example of a horror story that has way too much going on and isn't focused. A really great horror story will usually take a realistic scenario and then introduce like some weird supernatural element into it. Like take Christine, the Stephen King story, where there's just this like normal kid, he lives a normal life, and then all of a sudden this demon car gets introduced to it, and weird shit starts happening. But it's just the demon car, a solitary paranormal element in an otherwise realistic and believable scenario. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, the problem is that it starts out being about psychic powers, and then it ends with something completely different that, according to these comments, is completely unrelated and has nothing to do with his psychic powers, which is not a benefit of the episode. In fact, it's a drawback of the episode, because if the climax of your episode, if the climax of your story has nothing to do with the actions that preceded it, and the only thing that's different is whether or not Clint Howard goes on TV and says like, oh, it's going to be paradise. If that's the only thing that changes, it doesn't matter, because no matter what, the sun is just going to explode. If he has no effect on it, if him learning about supernovas did not result in a supernova, if the sun was just going to explode no matter what, then it's an even worse story. Because no matter what the characters did, whether or not The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes had his own show, whether or not he was exploited by the media, whether or not, the TV executives were greedy enough to exploit this child, the sun was just going to explode and none of it was going to matter because they'd all be dead. Which is kind of a really shitty story if you think about it for even a second, like a story with zero moral and 0 point. So I'm pretty sure what the writers were going for is that, the reason that the sun exploded is because he knew about supernovas, and it went supernova because he knew about supernovas, and his psychic powers are just that strong. And you kind of have to be dense not to draw that conclusion, and I stand by that. That's my interpretation of the episode. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes is attempting to be a story about exploitation of gifted people by the media, which is an admirable thing to write a sci-fi horror story about, but I think it's really poorly executed, and it's poorly written, and it's a bad episode. It's absolutely one of Night Gallery's worst. It's fucking insipid. I can't stand it. So just some comments there. Just proof that I do read what you write down in the comment box below. If you have thoughts on this, feel free to let me know. I'd love to hear it, because I think this kind of stuff is very interesting. And I'm honored to be one of the only Gen Zers out here talking about Night Gallery, because Night Gallery is the type show that deserves serious analysis and thought. And it's a show that, like I said, I have immense respect for, but every show has its lame episodes, and some are just going to be bad. And, that's just how TV shows work in general. And I can't stand The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, so this is kind of just my response to that. It is an episode I think you should watch, just because it gives an example of how weird Night Gallery could get at points and how disjointed and incoherent it could get, which is one of the charms of this series when you get right down to it. It's one of the things that makes Night Gallery a unique viewing experience. It makes you feel like you've stumbled onto something weird and decrepit. But on the other hand, it is legitimately just an example of terribly written speculative fiction that's really fucking messy. Ironically, I could have suspended my disbelief a lot more for The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes and its outrageous ending if it was one of the silly episodes, like the one where Cesar Romero is a vampire, or the one where, Colonel Klink throws a funeral and all the Igors and witches and shit come. Because, those are silly segments that aren't meant to be taken seriously. But The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes just presents itself as like very heavy-handed and creepy and serious and deep. And then it just launches into full-on lunacy at the end, which I think is just really priceless. Just really an example of like the 70s in action, the 70s at work, back when like nobody knew what was coming up and shit was just erratic and wild. And you wouldn't get something like that today. You wouldn't get a story as crazy as Boy Predicted Earthquake today. Everything these days is market tested and fucking formulaic and bland. Back in the 70s, you had stories where the fucking sun just blows up at the end. Goofy shit like that. To make legitimate innovation in screenwriting and directing and filmmaking, you need to take risks. You need to go crazy, and even if it doesn't pan out, you'll have something there. You'll have a basis to work off of. You'll have something to improve off of. You need to be willing to go for the novel, the bizarre, and the interesting. And at the end of the day, I think that's the moral we can all agree on and take away from this whole debacle. It's been very interesting to see so many people defend an episode they like and I can't stand. It's very interesting in general to be talking about Night Gallery. That said, that's it for this video. Just a little response video. But there are some very interesting points to be made with this whole thing about the nature of speculative fiction, about the importance of writing believable stuff, and I'd say overall about suspension of disbelief and how to create that effectively within an audience. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. Sayonara, suckers.